Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now I've talked before about primeval creatures on this channel and I've talked about real current creatures, but I've never before talked about mythical creatures. So with this in mind I thought it was about time to rectify that and to talk a bit about the BBC documentary Fantastic Beasts: A Natural History. Now this was obviously done as basically kind of PR for the Fantastic Beasts film that came out earlier this year. What's it called? The Secrets of Dumbledore, I think it's called. And it's narrated by and indeed presented by Stephen Fry. J.K. Rowling appears in it, and it obviously is kind of it's kind of creative to try and raise the profile for the film. But it is in itself a brilliant documentary, and I think it's well worth watching, even if you don't particularly like Harry Potter. It looks at a lot of kind of mythical creatures, so griffins, dragons, unicorns, mermaids, krakens, and looks at the actual real-life natural history behind it. And with this in mind, I thought it'd be a good idea to have a little look at it and to see what kind of things and kind of conclusions they come to. So I particularly enjoyed the bit they did on the dragons. Now, I talk quite a lot about dinosaurs on this channel, and it's, in fact, they look quite a lot about how the bones of dinosaurs might well have inspired the stories of dragons. Now, I'd heard about this theory before, but I'd always assumed it was principally creationist theory. I don't know how much any of you watching particularly know about creationism, but creationists believe that at some point in human history, or early on, humans and dinosaurs coexist, because obviously everything was created about the same, well, in the same week by God, so therefore there would be a certain amount of coexistence. So the idea behind that is obviously dinosaurs are kind of a folk memory of, dragons are kind of a folk memory of dinosaurs, and sort of over time they obviously got embellished and people had wings and fire breathing and all that kind of stuff. Now, I've always had quite a soft spot for this theory. I think it's quite fun. Whether or not you believe in it probably depends on whether you believe in creationism and God or not. But it is interesting that actually evolution itself has kind of latched onto parts of this theory, and the idea that dinosaur bones could certainly have encouraged the idea of dragons, I think is quite plausible. I did particularly enjoy the way they kind of skirt around the creationist aspect of this theory. They didn't even mention the word. It was I quite enjoyed the small part where Stephen Fry and these paleontologists kind of mentioned the fact that obviously humans and dinosaurs didn't coexist, which I really, really enjoyed, I have to admit. I thought it was almost like they were going, don't mention the C word, as if, people would think well-renowned atheist and skeptic Stephen Fry suddenly had a change of heart. But thankfully, they don't dwell too much on that kind of, what we might call the more kind of political and argumentative aspects, and just look at the fossils. And it's certainly true that if you found a bunch of dinosaur fossils lying round, you'd think, that some of those ones in Utah look like they died yesterday almost. And you can certainly understand how somebody coming across those might possibly come to quite reasonable conclusion that there were these big lizardy creatures roaming round. It's actually quite cool, really, when you think about it. It makes you wonder how many small, Native American children went to bed a bit afraid, thinking that maybe there were still these big lizards out there somewhere. The other bit I really, really enjoyed was the bit with the unicorn in it. Now, a bit of personal details here. I actually work at a 14th century castle, and there's actually a unicorn on the front of the gatehouse. It was the kind of the personal emblem, that badge, if you like, of the owner of the castle. And we talk obviously about it quite a lot, because obviously small children, particularly like young girls under the age of 10, really enjoy seeing a unicorn, because unicorns are quite popular, aren't they, particularly among small children. We talk about it quite a lot to visitors, and I have to admit, I've always thought, actually, when you think about it, unicorns aren't that fantastical when you really boil them down. They're basically just a horse with a horn on their head that, have some magical properties. When you think about it, narwhals, the creatures that are probably most likely to have some basis on the unicorn myth, you think about it, they're much weirder. If you came back and said, you never guess what we saw when we were on our voyage up the Arctic Circle? Well, what did you see? We saw these great big, whales with these big long spikes on their head. And a skeptical, observer would think, oh yes, of course you did, yes. And I suppose there were some mermaids around there as well, were there? Because when you really boil them down, narwhals are weird, aren't they? I mean, we don't really even know now, with all the advantages of modern science, what their tusks are actually used for. We know what they are. They're long teeth, but as to what they actually use them for is still very much up for debate. And indeed, I do know that they mentioned it kind of in the actual documentary. Stephen Fry looks at kind of a replica narwhal horn. And in fact, when Frobisher went up to the Arctic Circle, he was one of the first European explorers to venture that far north, and he met the native people, the Inuit. He actually traded with them for narwhal horns, and presented one of them to Elizabeth I. And it's actually you can quite. I don't think it was a terrible leap in logic when he found these, because I mean it's probably quite likely he didn't see the actual creature they came from, that he thought they just came from a unicorn, because that's what he would have thought. And indeed, I can't imagine that a canny native of the Arctic Circle would really have probably disabused him of that illusion. These Europeans turn up and very anxious to get some narwhal horns. You're not going to go, well, actually, they don't come from big horses. Assuming you even know what a big horse is. So, you can quite see how the idea of this myth really was propagated. Interestingly, the one thing they don't point out, they talk a lot about how, the unicorn is the national badge of Scotland, but what they don't tell you is when, obviously, the union of England and Scotland happened in the under the reign of James I, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. They actually, the unicorn was amalgamated onto kind of the royal coat of arms, but and here's the twist, if you look at the coat of arms closely, you can actually see that the unicorn has a collar around its neck and it's actually chained, which, is something, if you're a Scottish nationalist, you can, draw, your own conclusions from. It's quite nice to see that the English have always had a certain distrust of the Scottish. But yes, I mean, certainly the idea that unicorns existed was very much a fact, well, believed as a fact in medieval times. There was even a theory that the reason you didn't see them was because they were so fast. You sort of, if you saw something out of the corner of your eye, if you were deep in a forest, that was probably a unicorn, but it was heading off into the distance at a great rate of knots. The other thing I really enjoyed is when you see Stephen Fry and they have that massive Stella sea eagle, which he actually gets to hold at one point. He looked understandably very nervous, and I have to say I don't really blame him. It was a really good idea for them to use a Stella sea eagle, because they do look kind of primeval and mythical anyway. They're one of the largest eagles in the world anyway, but they look so fantastic, even more so than sort of native British eagles like golden eagles, or even the American bald eagle. They have those massive, almost like pickaxe beaks, which the falconer in the documentary said, and I've never heard this before, but it seems very logical. He said they actually used, obviously the Stella seagulls eat a lot of fish, but when obviously you catch a fish in Siberia, it turns to, basically frozen solid very quickly, and therefore he surmised, and I think it's quite likely, you need a big beak to kind of break it down. And I really like the way that, the eagle, I can totally understand why Stephen Fry looked so worried, because, it didn't look that happy to be on his fist, to be honest. It was, the bit I really enjoyed was the bit when it wanted to come back to its handler, the falconer, and it kind of started to mantle a little bit. Stephen Fry looked like he was only too pleased to get rid of it. But the idea actually, they inspired kind of mythical creatures like griffins or the rock. It isn't really that fantastical. Indeed, they actually make mention of one of my favourite primeval creatures. I say primeval, actually. I mean, they existed up until the 14th century, so they're not really primeval, are they? But the Haast's eagle, which was this amazing, massive eagle that lived in New Zealand comparatively recently, in sort of, obviously in, evolutionary terms, shall we say. It was about, half the size of a 6-foot man, so it's quite capable of killing somebody. And it actually, as they say, it ate moas, which are obviously those big flightless birds that existed in New Zealand for a very, very long time. And it's, yeah, I must admit, if there was any one animal you could go back in time and see, that would probably be the bird I want to see. It just seems so amazing that these huge birds of prey were roaming around New Zealand hunting, birds that, in my mind, I don't think that moas were actually quite the size of ostriches, but they certainly probably weren't far away from it. And the idea that these big other birds that hunted them actually seems quite incredible and quite cool. It's always fascinated me. And the idea that they actually encourage sort of Maori legends of these kind of huge, like, flying spirits. I can't remember quite what they're called. I'll put the word up on the screen. I think they're called something like Purukoi or something. But yeah, the idea they inspire these terrifying legends is, completely understandable. I mean, I'm sure they did, quite literally eat people sometimes. So yeah, I can totally understand why people were so fascinated, but also worried by these ideas, these flying animals. They also have a bit of an interview at the end with J.K. Rowling, and I kind of assumed, I sort of thought, this is probably done mainly just for, PR, basically. But it is quite cool hearing her talk about how she creates various creatures. I'm not a massive fan of Harry Potter, but I have read all the books, and I've watched quite a lot of the films, and I've even done the Pottermore test on which Wizarding House, so I suppose, I've got more on the casual interest in the series, and it was quite cool her talking about the fact that basically it's very difficult to actually think up something that isn't based in nature. She created this creature from her own nightmares, like this huge black cloak that would kind of envelop you, and in the middle of the night. And it sounds absolutely disgusting. And then she said she looked back after she'd created it, and kind of thought, actually, that's a manta ray, isn't it? Really, just it doesn't live in water. And Stephen Fry actually pointed out the word manta even means cloak. So it's kind of interesting how the human imagination it kind of latches onto things around you and then kind of then embellishes them, and it's quite easy to see how you could look at real life animals and then create a kind of imagined world around it. So yeah, I totally recommend this documentary. It was really good fun. I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, if you like the sort of fantastical and the mythical, and even just like hearing about kind of different interesting creatures and how they've influenced humanity and human imagination, it's well worth a watch. It feels a very kind of Christmassy documentary, I think it's fair to say. It's got that kind of, not only has it got that kind of Harry Potter connection, but it feels quite magical, and also, of course, it's got the kind of Harry Potter connection to it. So I always feel that Harry Potter, a lot of them early films anyway, are kind of very Christmassy films. So yeah, it clearly has that kind of influence and vibe going for it. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. That was the Sherlockian. Thanks very much for watching, film fans. If you're interested in seeing more of my videos, you can subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on Twitter if that's something you're interested in. The link to my channel's in the description below. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.